We live in a graveyard world. Everywhere you look are graveyards and tombstones. If you walk outside, chances are you're walking on someone's grave. This is a ghost town in northern New Mexico where there's a graveyard. This is a graveyard in Normandy with the graves of Allied invaders of D-Day. This is the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in Arlington National Cemetery. A graveyard world. The most massive structures ever built on Earth were the ancient Egyptian pyramids, but they were just giant tombstones containing the remains of the pharaohs in secret chambers underneath. The Great Pyramid of Giza was built in 2070 to 2050 BC, and it took 20 years to build, consisting of 2.3 million limestone blocks weighing an average of 2.5 tons each. This means that they had to set in place 12 blocks an hour every day and night, 24 hours a day for 20 years. A massive tombstone. Ancient Egyptian civilization was a graveyard civilization devoted to tombs and graves. The most beautiful building on Earth is said to be the Taj Mahal in Uttar Pradesh, India, built in 1632 to 54 by Shah Jahan for his wife who died in childbirth. It's a white marble mausoleum. The most beautiful building in London is Westminster Abbey, which is a church, but it contains hundreds of graves, so it's a type of mausoleum. When I was there, I stood on the grave of John Hunter, the famous 18th century surgeon. Buried there are Chaucer, Queen Elizabeth I, Oliver Cromwell, Sir Isaac Newton, George Frederick Handel, William Wilberforce, Charles Dickens, David Livingstone, Charles Darwin, Rudyard Kipling, and many others. In Washington, D.C., this beautiful memorial is the Lincoln Memorial, which is like a giant tombstone. Now, to be sure, many buildings are built for the purposes other than being graves and tombstones, but somehow they have a way of turning into them. The tallest point on Earth is Mount Everest, which is like a giant tombstone because it contains the bodies of hundreds of deceased climbers, frozen on the top because it's too dangerous to bring them down. A giant graveyard at the top of the world. As you hike along the trail to the summit, you pass hundreds of graves. The lowest point in the United States is Death Valley, which contains the graves of many who died trying to cross it. What is the lowest point on the earth? You guessed it, the Dead Sea. The water is so salty because there's no outlet, so nothing can grow in it. How can we explain this graveyard world in which we live? What is the significance of these graves and this death that dominates everything? Perhaps the ancient Egyptians can tell us. After all, they lived in a mortuary society where their entire science, industry, and art was devoted to graves and to preserving the bodies of the deceased for the afterlife. This is the pure gold mummy of King Tut. The process of mummification was an elaborate procedure whereby the organs would be removed and preserved separately. The body was then soaked in natron, a salt solution, for about 70 days, wrapped in multiple layers of cloth, enclosed in nested coffins, and finally placed into a large stone sarcophagus, all to preserve the body of the deceased for the afterlife. The greatest work of literature in ancient Egypt was the Book of the Dead, which was an anthology multiply copied and changed over the centuries and included with the mummies in in the pyramids. Here we have Thoth, the underworld god, weighing the heart of the deceased to see if he qualifies for the afterlife. If not, he would be eaten by the crocodile-headed god Ammon. The Book of the Dead describes what the Egyptians thought might happen in the afterlife, but it does not at all explain the significance of death, what it represents, and why we live in a graveyard world. The mummification process was designed to preserve the bodies from decomposing, but ultimately they would decompose and turn into dust. How many graves are there in our graveyard world? Some estimate that the number of people who have ever lived on Earth and died is roughly equal to the population today, or about 7 billion. This means there are 7 billion graves in our world. The bodies of these 7 billion dead have decomposed, and their elements have diffused into the environment, and into the seas, and into the air. Decomposition involves the process of putrefaction, bacterial and insect action, black liquefaction, and then complete combustion of the organics into CO2 and water, leaving behind minerals of dust and salts. These minerals leach into the soil and are washed into the rivers and streams and out into the ocean, and the organics enter the atmosphere. We live in a graveyard world with 7 billion decomposed bodies. That means when you breathe air, the CO2 you're breathing contains carbon that could have been part of some body. And when you drink a glass of water, there are molecules of water there that were part of once living people. A graveyard world. How can we understand and explain this?